Hi, everybody. I'd like to thank the MountainWest crew for having me out here, and I'd like to thank Ernie Miller for swapping with me yesterday since I was delirious in bed with the stomach flu. So, much better today. So today we're going to talk about the timeless way of building, and little background on me just so you understand where I'm coming from. I actually have my master's in architecture of the building variety, not of the software variety. Been doing design and code from the HyperCard days, and I currently do freelance design and front-end work through Meticulous, which is my own company, and then I'm also the head of design for CARGOSENSE, which is a new startup that Bruce Williams, Rich Kilmer, and myself, and about 3 other people are working on. Bruce and I also wrote this book, The Rails View, which some of you may have read. And if you haven't, we have a discount code, but I will say that it's now, with all the JavaScript stuff happening, it's a little bit out of date. But what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about patterns and what patterns mean. We're going to talk about architecture of the building type and where pattern languages in history kind of evolved from. We're going to look at antipatterns from a software perspective, and then we're going to apply some of Christopher Alexander's theory to what we're doing and kind of look at it from a new angle. So when we talk about patterns in software, what are we talking about? This is a book that some of you may have read. It is the Gang of Four book, it's commonly referred to. How many of you guys have seen this, read it, use it? Okay, good. So this book introduced many programmers to the concepts of patterns and pattern languages. And they defined pattern language as such. It's basically, it systematically names, motivates, and explains general design that addresses recurring design problems. And so it's made up of 4 parts. And it's the pattern name, the problem, when do we apply this pattern, what's the right context for it, the solution, so what elements make up the design, the relationships, the responsibilities, and it's not particular, but it's quite abstract. And then the consequences, what do I gain or lose by using this pattern? And the Gang of Four talked about that design patterns help you identify less obvious abstractions and the objects you can capture. For example, objects that represent a process or algorithm don't occur in nature per se, but they are a crucial part for our flexible designs. So when the Gang of Four talked about these things, there was a lot of static typing going on. So this is the iterator pattern from the Gang of Four book. And so doing a lot of these things in C++, in Java, and those kind of languages can be painful and takes up a lot of your time. However, in Ruby, we have these wonderful things already figured out for us in many cases by Mats and the countless people that have worked on the Ruby code base over the years. So we don't have to deal with some of those painful patterns at the bottom level. So when we look at what patterns consist of, where did they come from, though? So they're not the tartan, it's not the interior decorating mentality of a pattern, but it's from architecture. So this is Christopher Alexander. He has been an architectural theorist for longer than I've been alive. And these are 3 books. You probably have heard of the middle one, but we're going to talk today about the first one. The pattern language is the middle one. It was published in 1977, so it is now as old as me. And it's 1,170 some odd pages long. He is not exactly, brevity is not his thing. Let's put it that way. But he gets into, the pattern language is kind of like his construction kit. But A Timeless Way of Building talks about where patterns come from and why we use them in the first place. So how can you distribute, like his quest in all of these things is how can you distribute your responsibility for design through all levels of a large hierarchy while still maintaining consistency and harmony in that overall design. Now, he's talking about architecture, but this applies very simply to software and pretty much any creative pursuit. So how do we as developers with disparate experience write code together and end up moving in the same direction? What he ended up trying to do here, he wanted to design a college campus, which is the Oregon experiment where he documents that. So you have to talk about the students and the professors and all these different use cases. Now, you as an individual may have had some of those use cases in your life, but you can't possibly have had every use case. Unless you've got some magic time machine or some reincarnation thing I don't know about, we're pretty much stuck with our limited experiences. And this really applies to that pesky thing we call clients or customers, really getting into that community and understanding those needs. So how do we bring those people in? And you can't just say, well, you design it to the end user because you know it's going to be awful, because they don't have your expertise as a software developer, or in this case, as an architect. So some of these patterns and things like that are kind of like really difficult to grasp the first time you go through it. So one of them is something called a transition space between the street and a front door. To break that down, that's the name. So the problem is trying to solve that it's too abrupt to go from a public space to a private space. So the street is a public space, the house is a private space. The solution is a transition would help people move from that into a semi-public space and then into the private space. But notice I haven't said what that is. Implementations of that pattern are a stoop, a front yard, a porch. There's countless implementations around the world as you look at things, even things such as foyers or receiving halls in larger structures. But it's not, when you talk about the pattern, you don't talk about a foyer. You talk about a transition. And the consequences. So what are the consequences? Some of the good versus the bad. You know, I'm reducing the available space on the street. If I have a stoop, I'm breaking into the sidewalk. Or if I've got, I'm pushing the house back, I've got a setback now in the yard. Delay the entry into the structure. I mean, these can be good and bad things. And patterns contain patterns. It's patterns all the way down. They talk about everything from the overall layout of a town or a city down to the smallest interactions and even down to architectural detailing about how things go together at the micro level. And so what I want you to think about is that what we call principles are in fact patterns. This is a pattern. Don't repeat yourself. It's all about efficient code writing. Yagni, you ain't going to need it. Don't go complex up front. This is a pattern. This is something very broad that can be applied all over the place. Here's some others you probably have heard about. Single responsibility principle, that a class should have only a single responsibility. Open close, that software entities should be open for extension but closed for modification. LSP, that objects in a program should be replaceable with instances of their subtypes without altering the correctness of that program, or you can look at also design by contract. ISP, interface segregation principle. Many client-specific interfaces are better than one general-purpose interface. And DIP, depend upon abstractions, do not depend upon concretions. Now, put those together and what do you have? Another principle, or another pattern. So patterns contain patterns all the way down. So where did these things come from in architecture? Patterns used to be, in the 17th, 18th century, came out of these pattern books. So pattern books were effectively somebody's portfolio. This happened to be Robert and James Adam, who are two of the more famous neoclassical architects. And what they did would basically publish various drawings from structures they had built, because back in the day, you basically could do plates. You couldn't really do photographs, things of that nature. So everything was a drawing of some type. So you have an elevation, you have a detail. So we're going from the macro to the micro scale here. And you can start looking at other things like Robert Morris also published. This was in 1750. So he heavily influenced early American architecture, colonial and federal style specifically. So plate 3 here was this guy was in the UK. So this was a design that he came up with, may or may not have been built. This is Battersea, which is in Petersburg, Virginia, which is south of Richmond, the capital. But now if we look at the two, up top and down bottom, they're not the same thing, but they have very similar elements, and they're applied in a similar way. Andrea Palladio's 4 books on architecture probably was one of the critical books that was the basis for the architectural renaissance. And this is Villa Cornaro that he designed. This is the original design for Monticello by Thomas Jefferson. So now you look at the top, you look at the bottom. Again, we have the similar portico, but it's got fewer columns. You know, Jefferson got rid of the kind of surround and just put the wings onto it. But then, of course, Jefferson went to France. And this is the Hotel de Somme, which is the French Foreign Legion kind of hall, and it's right on the River Seine down in Old Paris. And this looks like it's only 1 story tall, but in fact it's many stories. And so when he got back, Monticello became this. There are 3 stories in a basement in this building. The line break for the floor is actually right here. If you go in and you ever tour the building, it's amazing because you're walking through and the window stops at the ceiling on the first floor, and you go up to the second floor, and there's this square window on the floor. So, compare the two. You know, they're similar, they're derivative, but there's differences. But what's happening here is that they're all working in the language of classical architecture. There's very specific things that are defined about the orders of classical architecture. And so these kind of patterns are things that Christopher Alexander started looking at, and he also went more abstract and more generic in his thing. And some of the examples that I want to show you, just to give you some ideas of how these things exist. Light from two sides of the room. This is the Wren building at William & Mary. You got just natural light coming in. Now, if you change that to light from one side, totally different feel to the space. Stronger shadows, different vibe. You're going to get an afternoon or a morning sun as opposed to sun at both times of the day. Or what about light from above? Any ideas what this is? It's a violin. Micro scale. Or St. Peter's, macro scale. Same concept, light from above. Now, granted, we don't experience this that often, but it's to get to the point. Amish barns are another example that Alexander uses all the time. In the past, there weren't drawings or building permits or architects in that sense. Architecture as a profession only started to happen in the mid-late 1800s in France with the École des Beaux-Arts. So before that, they were master builders. And so if you wanted a barn, you went to your neighbors and said, hey, I need a barn. I've got, I need stalls for the horses and the cattle, and you kind of figured out what you needed. And then you just got together and built it because we had this understood community language of how a barn is built. You need an extra stall? That's fine. We can just add one. You don't have to go and get it approved and get a stamp or any of that stuff we need today. It was just the way things were done. People just knew how to build things. And it comes down to looking at that, we talk about being craftsmen or engineers or architects a lot in software. And what does this mean is that we basically are there's a very strong allegory to that we are builders. And it's not a wrong analogy. If any of you have seen Glenn Vanderberg's Real Software Engineering talk, you might recognize this quote. But engineers frequently have to make decisions of great practical consequence in the face of incomplete and uncertain knowledge. And Walter Vincetti said that. And patterns help us do that. They help us look at the best practices available to solve a problem. However, Richard Gabriel talks about this a lot. Too many people think that design patterns are plug and play. Is like code templates, or I'm just going to apply it and I'm done and I don't have to do anything. And design does this too. Visual designers, just makes me mad. It's like these are implementations. These are not patterns. These are people implementing patterns in different ways. So instances of a class is a good way to think about this. So please stop confusing everybody. Brian Hogan put it well. He's a Ruby and Rails writer. Design patterns are suggested approaches seen in the wild. So what are we striving towards here with all this? What are patterns getting us to? And Christopher Alexander talks about the quality of a space that has no name. So how many of you guys have traveled you can even talk about downtown Salt Lake, but how many of you guys have gone to older cities, especially in Europe or things like that? And you kind of walk down that street and there's just a vibe to it. There's a feeling to it, and then you go to a strip mall, and it's completely devoid of that feeling. That's what he's talking about in this example. So Gibellina, Italy, it's on the western end of Sicily. It was destroyed in the 1968 earthquake, and a new town was built 20 kilometers away. And the old town, an artist went and put concrete blocks on what was the floor plans, and the footprints of the building, And you can see you've got narrow streets, you've got, it just kind of got built as it went. There's not a clean grid, there's not organization, it just was built as it was built. Gibellina Nuovo is designed by many of the most prominent architects in Italy, and it's, everything's supposed to be great, and it feels awful. It feels like a ghost town when you walk through it. And for anybody who's been in a small Italian town, that's the antithesis of that vibe. You expect to walk down the street and have shops open and have people moving, and this is the middle of the day. And part of the problem is narrow streets in a hot Mediterranean climate in the middle of the summer give you shade. This gives you nothing. So this is what I'm going to start talking about, anti-patterns. This is an architectural anti-pattern. So anti-patterns are also, you can talk about them as code smells, but it's really an example. You see a lot of anti-patterns happen when you have non-fluent developers working in a code base. It's building a house on a shoddy foundation. The good news is, unlike architecture, usually you don't have to tear the whole building down to fix a lot of these things. In some cases you do, but that's not always the case. Most often these are created because the developer didn't know this was the wrong way to do it. They just, hey, the test passed. So some of these that I'm going to show you are mainly Rails-based, and so there's going to be a little bad X in the upper right and a green check for decent. So like we said, this is the bad architecture thing. And you can also talk about, these are, anybody familiar with the big ball of mud paper? Okay, this is something you all should read. It's really great. Brian Foote and Joseph Yoder wrote this, and they define a bunch of software antipatterns in this. This is purely a software paper. So this is shanty town, big ball of mud, too many tools, everyone is working in their own direction, there's no investment in infrastructure. If that sounds like your project, you might want to check it out. Some other bad examples, Pete Jackson from Intridia sent me this when I was asking for antipatterns when I first put this together. This is where taking something that's good to the extreme is bad. We must test everything. So there are cases where testing and migration is required just because you're going to break something in production if it's in any way, shape, or form wrong. But always testing every migration, probably overkill. Something you'll see a lot when you first get into Active Record, I can walk the tree. This is great. Woo, all the way down. Really brittle, super brittle. Law of Demeter kind of applies here. So it's something where you can start extracting this out, and you could even go straight up to the account and create a method on account where instead of having to have that brittleness, you can really abstract it out. So you now have one method that you can test if the customer's address state is actually valid all the way down. This is just a simplification one level up. It should, okay, I'm not sure. Oh yeah, here we go, builds. So we want to look at things that are composition and delegate. So instead of a long tree, we're going to extract something, and it's going to live in parallel to our class, and that's a single responsibility principle at work. Fat models, we've heard this all the time. It started off that, in PHP land, everything was in one file, and then, it's like there's always this one part of a Rails app where it's like things are getting kicked to, and then somebody identifies it as, this is awful, and then it moves to the next level, and suddenly we've solved this problem. So fat models is one that's been there, but it's, a lot of methods can happen on models, and after a while it gets out of control. So, if you're going to look at things where, you can do the SRP stuff again and utilize composed of, but the only downside of composed of is you can't modify composed objects in place, so it won't persist or throw a frozen exception, which doesn't help us all that much. So, if you can go through the model and group things into logical blocks, that should be ripe for refactoring, and there's lots of ways to approach this, especially if the methods feel as they're really not part of the model's mandate. And so depending on what you're looking at, any of these 5 items would be a good place to start. Now, you probably don't want to start with an engine. Probably not the right thing to do. But, if you get to that point of complexity, maybe that needs to be extracted, especially if you're sharing it across multiple apps. Callbacks, transactionals. If your app doesn't seem to fit in the active record lifestyle and you're building a Rails app, you might be using the wrong tool. Something to think about. Rails is also a series of very large libraries. We're going on over 8 years, I think. I don't know if Aaron's here. He could probably say better as how long the core has been being built. But there's a lot of gold in there to dig through and find, and there's a lot of things that I see people replicating that's actually in the Rails stack. If you have complex finders, let's go look at some scopes. And then you can take this, and there's layers and layers of refactoring. That's what's so exciting about so many things. There's so many ways to solve these problems, and you can constantly be improving your code. Generators, pretty much without fail, are great for prototyping and awful for production. You're going to end up with a lot of stuff you don't need. Go for something with like normalization, dynamic methods, things along those lines. There's lots of ways to get past this. You see people like, oh, I'm clever, I'm going to write a DSL for this problem we're solving. There's not a need unless, this is, again, don't extract too early. From the Rails view side of things, a lot of this is painful to me. You see everything's a div. or a lot of PHP constructs from people that came from different programming languages and are trying to apply those things they learned to Rails or Ruby. Using render partial, render collection, content for blocks, all these powerful things like start to open up opportunities for us. Typographic refactoring is something that a friend of mine he had put up this article about, and it's basically just about making your code easier to read. If you have a line that's over 80 characters, break it up. It's not a problem. It'll still render down, but it's all about developer happiness. MVC, we know and live this one, but people who are not working, if you haven't worked outside of the Rails routes system in a while, and you go work on a PHP project and you're trying to write routes in a .ht access file, you will quickly be very thankful for the tools you have. Untested code, if it's not tested, it's going to break and it's going to cause you a problem. Fat controllers like fat models, we've got too much weight there. And this is becoming, these are issues that apply now also to everything's going to these JavaScript one-page apps. Well, if you've got everything in one file in that one-page app, it's going to be really difficult to work with, really difficult to test, really difficult to understand for a new developer coming on that project. So, I could go on for weeks about this stuff, but if you want to get deeper into this, there's two great books. I am not associated with either one, but Rails Antipatterns and also Design Patterns in Ruby by Russ Olson. So back to the theory. The kernel of the way is something that Alexander talks about. So how do we apply this stuff to software? And this bears repeating. It's suggested approaches seen in the wild. Evan Light also put it nicely that fat model, skinny controller, extracting your domain models from active record, these are recipes. Think and do what works in your context. And Jeff Atwood has done a whole bunch of speaking about pattern stuff. Most of it was in 2005. He wrote a bunch of great articles. Patterns, like all forms of complexity, should be avoided until they are absolutely necessary. And you can't say that you're applying the design of the pattern correctly unless you're confronting the problem that it's supposed to fix. So this is a problem because you get a new developer that's like, I just got this pattern book. Oh my God, I'm going to use it everywhere. And you say, new developer, what are you doing? And he's like, well, I got the first solution. It worked. Next. Okay. That's not the best solution, though, but it worked. So it's not about using the patterns. It's about speaking a language. Just as the master chess person is not, Gary Kasparov is not sitting there and running every single possible branch that could occur. Watson maybe, but Kasparov sure isn't. He's using a lot of intuition and years of experience to say that I feel that I'm going to go this way. I feel that this is better. So we need to move towards being eloquent and being fluent. And so let's go back to the character of a space that has no name. Gabriel wrote this, he's got a whole book on this stuff that was out in 2006, Patterns of Software Development. But his biggest complaint, and I agree with it, is that developers take so much inspiration from the simple mechanical parts of Alexander's work and ignore the heart of it. So they're all about the patterns themselves, as opposed to the concept of how patterns exist and how they look in a bigger world. So how do we see this happening in code? So let's talk about how Alexander really defines this. And basically, we're looking at that the ageless character has nothing to do, in fact, with languages. These things apply across the board. The language just releases the fundamental order which we understand inherently. They don't teach us, but they remind us of what we know. And so to make a building or software egoless, we need to start with a void. And we're able to do this when we don't say, well, I have to do X, Y, and Z and all these things. And so if I've ever found a better theory-based argument for test-driven development, it is this part of the book. And so at this state, your building or your software's life will come directly from your language. And I'm not talking about Ruby or Java or C. I'm talking about the way that you as a developer understand software and building software. So, we can have good patterns and something can still be awful software or an awful building. And Alexander had these issues himself when he did some projects in Mexico, where he actually tried to apply these patterns, and because of all the different people involved, things didn't work out the way he had planned. But for example, let's talk about like the pattern alcove, which you start off like, I need to put an alcove here. once you get into it, it's something where you're not thinking, oh, I'm going to use this pattern. You're just like, oh, an alcove would work well here because I understand the language of building better. Now, apply that to software. The yellow here, not because it's the concept is not what you're thinking of, but that it's appropriate. So I really think it's important for developers to go and read this book instead of a pattern language or reading about patterns to understand. Now, this is a thick theory book, but why they exist, where they come from, how language evolves, and how, as a native speaker, once you know their language, the patterns themselves fade away and they become just part of how you think, speak, or develop. So if you're really bold, go pick up all 3 books. They look great on the shelf, and you can read the italics. They have italic parts and non-italic parts, and so if you want to just get the concept of the book, you hit all the italic parts, and you can get through it pretty quick, and then you can go back and reread it for the pain and suffering aspect of it. It's more important here. This is what I really want to hit home. It's more important here to talk about the why. So much we talk about the how, and I think that so much of the why is lost. Why are we doing it this way? Why are we doing it that way? But I think you'll find that it applies, even though it's for architecture. I think it applies very heavily to software development as well. So thank you. I appreciate it. And if you are interested in the book, there's a code up there for a discount. And we have like 3 minutes, but if you guys you disagree with me, have ideas, things I missed, I mean, there's so much written in this area that it's not possible to go into any significant depth right now, but I'd love to get an email from you and be happy to talk about it. Thank you.